Hello, we're delighted to have Products of Change in the studio today. I'd like to welcome Helena Mansell-Stouffer, who's the founder and CEO of Products of Change, and James George, who is Strategic Sustainability Advisor for Products of Change. Products of Change have partnered with Spring and Autumn Fair to create a set of white papers to assist your journey to operating a more sustainable, ethical and regenerative business. Products of Change is a global educational hub aimed at driving sustainable change across consumer product markets and beyond by bringing together a strong community of brand owners, retailers, content creators, innovators, manufacturing partners, and marketing experts to learn and connect through the platform. So, welcome. Can we start by hearing from you a little bit more about Products of Change?
Of course, yeah. So Products of Change as a business is about 3 years old now. We actually started as a movement within the industry over 4 years ago. Amazing how quickly time flies. And we're really here to help industry really move to a more regenerative, sustainable, circular business. And we've got a long way to go, but there's so much innovation that's happening within industry. And so we're here to see how we can do this together and tell everybody stories of the great work that they're already doing.
I think the key thing there as well is it's not just about doing what is the latest trend. Actually, this is about some of the economics. You know, it's incredibly tough in business at the moment. How do we use these strategies to secure that business in the future? So this isn't about just doing the right thing. It's about doing the right thing that's also the best thing for the business to safeguard it for the future. And I think that's what's really powerful with the sort of licensing industry and working with Products of Change and the different brands is that actually it is such a huge opportunity if folks get this right. The problem is, where do they start? How do they get into the conversation? Because it feels really, really complicated.
Yeah, of course. And we're, of course, absolutely delighted to be working with you on this project. You know, we've got a huge community out there who are desperate to know more about how to get started. I think everyone's heart is absolutely in the right place. And like you say, people just need a bit more kind of direction and help along the way to get started in the right way on this journey. So on that note, could you tell us a little bit about this project that we've embarked on together?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I know that when we first started talking, because you do have such a broad reach of people that you work with, from a brand owner to a retailer to a manufacturer and everybody in between, we wanted to look at how we can build some white papers to kind of give people a framework of where to start and kind of really navigate them on that next step. So that's why the Pathway to Sustainability is the first white paper. And then from then we go into the circular economy, the Green Claims Code, more about consumers, and then legislation, which is, I guess, the big hot potato at the minute because there's so much change on the way. And actually, as James said, we need to really start to showcase business, what's coming in the future, so we can really start getting business ready for it as well.
And also, you know, even with Helena's opening sort of gambit there, there's lots of phrases and terms and words. Like, where do you start? How do you demystify some of these what appear like inaccessible topics? And actually the idea of the papers and working with your team is to try and just bring it down to the individual businesses, some of the challenges that they face, which might not be about creating a great slogan or one-liner about what their strategy is going to do. It's actually what shows up every day. And I think our experiences with Spring and Autumn Fair in the past, walking around and talking to folks, and them talking about what they're trying to do and how they find it difficult, especially as a small, medium enterprise, the white papers look to kind of level that and allow people to understand where can they start and where should they focus first. You know, what is the best first step when we think about the journey?
Brilliant. And kind of, I guess, the other way around, what is the opportunity of Products of Change collaborating with Spring and Autumn Fair?
Well, I guess when you look at just the amazing stuff that's happening on the ground at the fairs, you know, there are some amazing products. People are making regenerative products. They're looking at how they reduce their packaging, how they produce differently. And then the voice that you have to be able to really showcase all of that innovation to those other companies that could then learn from the innovations that these companies are doing. I think, you know, that's the exciting part of working with you guys.
I guess there's also that kind of abstract philosophical perspective that, you know, climate change, biodiversity collapse, these are big, big, wicked meta challenges that we can't solve on our own.
Yeah.
So how do we collaborate with those folks who are going to amplify the message, who are going to allow us all to reach different audiences and allow us all to understand the role that we play in this sort of systems change, rather than us all trying to solve it on our own. How do we do that collectively? Which is why collaborations like this are really, really important to spread that education as far as possible.
Brilliant. Yeah, and the Spring and Autumn Fair communities, I think, are a really special community of people. You know, here at Hive, we really treasure that community. There's a lot of energy and passion in that community. So I'm sure if we all work together, we can definitely make some progression here.
Totally, and it's communities that drive change. You know, it's not somebody that sits at the top of a big company. It's actually everybody that's working within the company together that drive that change. So if we can work, you know, within your community with all those SMEs as well as those big companies, then actually, in theory, we should be able to make some really big progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, specifically for the retail industry, there's just a lot that you read about. There's a lot in the press. There's a lot of positive stuff. There's a lot of negative stuff as well. And I think that can be quite scary for people. There's also a lot of terminology and acronyms. And I know one of those is the subject of one of your white papers. So the circular economy. It's not retail specific, but it is absolutely a hot potato for the retail industry, and it's absolutely one that the retail industry has a big responsibility to crack. So could we start by hearing a little bit about the key themes of that particular white paper?
If I look at retail today, you know, we've got very used to a transaction where, you know, you go and you buy something and then you go away. But actually, how can retail have a different relationship with that consumer? And maybe you don't just walk in and buy something, you rent something or you take something back, or, you know, it's looking at how we completely change how we operate, actually. That's what we need to do, is a whole operational change. Yeah.
And I guess it's an interesting point. First and foremost, I think with any of these, as you quite rightly pointed out, any of these adjectives or topics, you have to do some reading around. You have to understand the depth of the problems. We're not going to do it justice here today to explain everything, and nor should we, because these are complex frameworks, challenges, but actually, how do you take the key bits out from a business? We think about the circular economy paper. What we wanted to do there was first demystify what the topic means. Now, folks have probably heard of the term. They might associate it with recycling, waste management, but it's much bigger than that. It's much broader than that. It's about generating an economic model globally, but we all have a part to play as part of the engines of our economy to create growth, but create growth within the limits of the planet that we live on. We have a global economy that's set up and has been set up for a good couple of 100 years on the idea of you take stuff out of the ground, you make a product, and then you sell it. And when that product's no longer useful, it gets thrown away. Whereas actually, what if we could redesign that relationship with a material? Rather than selling a material or a product once, what if you could sell it multiple times? Helena mentioned there about renting, this idea of servitization. If I can rent a car where I need to use it rather than buy a £25,000 car, that makes much more economic sense in terms of utility. But if I'm a manufacturer, I can then sell that asset more times. So this is not about anti-growth or degrowth, but looking at growth that's restorative and regenerative. And when we think about businesses and how this shows up, it can show up in a multitude of ways, whether that's in your packaging, whether it's in how you source material, whether it's the relationship that you have with your customer, with your supply chain, actually understanding how you can collaborate around doing this. But ultimately, it's around this idea of keeping materials in use, designing out waste and pollution, and creating business models that are restorative and regenerative by design. So it's a new economic way to look at the problem. But there's much more in the paper. And actually what we haven't done here at the moment is talk about the specifics of where this shows up for small to medium business owners.
And actually what's really fascinating, so we do educational workshops, so we've done a couple on the circular economy. And it's really fascinating when you get a group of people within business to sit down and really start picking away at how their business operates and to start to think of how they can do things differently. And there's always so many solutions and ideas that people go away so energized that actually there's a way to continue to make money, but actually in a different way, and that's really exciting.
And that's a really valid point as well. In that, take a single industry, a single product, a single geography. There's not one solution that's going to work across all of that. It has to be replicated. It has to be individual to that particular challenge. Yeah. And actually, that's the biggest thing for small businesses or businesses that sit in the value chain that maybe don't control some of the elements, is that where can you find where you need to start that's specific to you? And the easiest way to do that is to first understand why. What is your motivation? right? Why are you doing this? Is it because you spotted an opportunity, your competitors are doing it, your customers are asking for it? What is the mechanism there? And then understand who's already working on this as well. How do we build new partnerships, collaborative, pre-competitive partnerships that allow us to collectively move forward a bit faster and further? But fundamentally, at the heart of it, it's an opportunity. It's not about just doing the right thing. It's about doing the right thing and also unlocking that economic potential.
And what are your thoughts on the kind of split of responsibility, I suppose? How much of this is down to the retailer and how much of this is about changing consumer buying trends or renting trends, as you were saying?
I think it's everybody's responsibility because I think we know that the retailer moves when the consumer moves, the market moves when the retail demands it, and it goes all the way up the chain. And actually, I think it's everybody's responsibility in that whole value chain to take their piece from it. I think we've seen actually the last few years sustainability having this higher price and will consumers pay more money for it. But actually, the right thing to do is it to not be higher price, actually for it to be easy for the consumer to be able to choose to do the right thing. And there are some retailers out there that actually are leading with that message and probably taking a little bit more of the margin on their side to try and get the market moving and shifting. And other retailers are looking at different models like refill and rental. So I do think it's up to everybody to try and figure out what their part is to play in that whole value chain. But we do know that when a retailer says they want something, the whole market does jump. So I do actually think that retail does have a little bit more responsibility to really push the market forward.
We are seeing shifts in that kind of direction, right? And a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? There are only bad choices in a bad system. So actually, how do you make the right demand signals? How do the consumers know how to demand the right types of products or the right provenance of products, which then drives retailers, they then react to those market forces. So I mean, for me, to build on Helena's point, it has to come from the retailers, but it also has to come from our individual choices. It has to come from every element of that value chain to shift the way the system operates. We have this critical red alert for humanity, right? When we think about climate change, about staying below 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. If we think about the pathway to sustainability, the SDGs, part of that is about limiting that temperature rise by the end of the century. We've got to get to 50% emission reduction by 2030. We are way, way off. And we can't just rely on others to do it for us. So we all need to look for those opportunities to drive change, to drive demand. And we're seeing it show up with investors in very, very large brands saying, look, unless you start delivering on your sustainability agenda, we're going to start withdrawing our investment. We see it with boycotting and boycotting for consumers. We see it with brands being hauled over the coals for kind of greenwashing or kind of virtue signalling. And we talk about in the Green Claims Code paper around, the framework that supports that to make sure you don't fall foul of it. But we all need to be part of that dynamic to actually shift the way the system operates.
Completely. It's a big balancing act, isn't it, of everyone? And I think my personal opinion on it is that a lot of it does sit with the retailers. They're the ones that really need to drive the change. And I think that's the way that it becomes more sustainable as well, right? Because I think purely asking people to change their everyday habits a huge amount is not going to work. I think people are willing to give a little, but the rest of it needs to come from those retailers. Yeah. So there's a lot for them to do, isn't there? It must be quite overwhelming for them out there. You know, they've done their business in a certain way, sometimes for decades. And now they're being asked to do it in a totally different way. It must be really overwhelming.
But even just how we frame business and how we even show a good economy, GDP, it's all about buying more. We're not necessarily looking at the services, we're looking at what goes through the tills. And actually even retailers look at that, or the margin that they're getting, or even brands are not necessarily looking at the damaging effect of doing the wrong thing. Again, it's more of the financial in. So actually how we even view business and how we even track our growth needs to change. I know that obviously takes time. But we need to change that conversation of where the value lies, actually.
So
and to your point as well, around impact as well, Nikki, like if the three of us and everyone we know make conscious decisions for the rest of our lives, that probably pales into insignificance if a retailer sets out a proper strategy to do things right. Yeah. So there is always a balance between where is the shortest versus the most impactful activity that we can do. Yeah. So getting those large brands, those large organisations to start heading in the right direction is really, really critical. But we all have a role to play in that kind of hierarchy of shifting the way our global systems operate.
Completely. You can see for retailers how it can be quite scary and daunting to go on this journey. Greenwashing is obviously a massive topic. the Green Claims Code is a topic of another one of the white papers, because it is such a blocker, I think, for people. You know, I think there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that never gets spoken about for fear of greenwashing.
Yeah.
So how do we get the balance right in, yes, calling people out when they're going too far with what they're saying, versus discouraging people from talking about things openly, because that actually, it stops us having the conversation. So
totally.
how do we get that balance?
And actually there's a new phrase, green hushing, at the minute, or the green everything. But green hushing is a big problem actually, because people now aren't talking about what they're doing because they're so scared of talking about what they're doing. I mean, the Green Claims Code was put in place because, you know, we've seen a huge amount of products on the market claiming that they're sustainable products, but aren't necessarily being truthful with how they are sustainable, and actually what does that mean. So no longer can you say I am a sustainable product. You can say I use this much less plastic than whatever, or I am made from 90% organic cotton, but it's got to be the right claim. You've got to be able to show where that claim comes from, because otherwise it will continue, because you know, everybody jumps on the bandwagon saying it's a new trend, sustainability is a new trend, and actually this isn't a new trend. This is just what we have to do for us to survive, for the human race to survive. You know, so that's why you get people like the Competition and Marketing Authority put the Green Claims Code in place. You know, they're fining people a lot of money if they're saying the wrong thing, for misleading a consumer. And this isn't anything that's going to be slowing down either. There's a huge amount going through now within the European Union as well, with new legislation.
It's only going to get more intense. So you have to keep yourself informed and make sure you don't fall foul. And there's something, you know, very fundamental here around, do you lead with the best possible story, or do you lead with the best possible product, but be ready to tell that story? And I think the last 12 months, a lot of brands, a lot of big popular brands who we've trusted in the past, people like Innocent, H&M, have led with the story, the best possible story. And then all of a sudden, through the Green Claims Code, the ASA have found themselves being pulled over the coals because actually they have been found guilty of greenwash. So the best thing, whether your business big or small, is staying up to date with the legislation that adheres to your position in the market. And that's what we look to do with the Green Claims Code paper, is sort of say, look, this is where you need to go, these are the types of things. And when you think about legislation, is that a carrot, is that a stick? I think if it's always a stick, by the time you get to that point, the need for it is too late. How do brands get out ahead of this? How do businesses get out ahead of this and use it as an advantage? But fundamentally, by proving the mechanism and the system and the business model first, being prepared to tell the story, but not leading just with the best marketing story, is always going to stand you in better stead than just telling a great story and then being caught short because you've fell short of the policy.
And so what are the fundamentals, I suppose, for those SME retailers? How do they start talking about sustainability and feel confident that they're not going to fall into the greenwashing trap?
I think it's, if you make a claim, if you don't understand the piece of marketing that you've made the claim with, then nobody else is going to understand it. That means you can probably not defend it. And if you can't defend it, it's probably not true. So actually, you must always go back to the truth of what you're saying, and then have, if you're going to market, you have your marketing lead from that. Because otherwise, you know, it goes to another department in a company and that gets changed, and it gets changed, and before you know it, you are then greenwashing.
It's very difficult right now, right? Because there's so many things to try and understand. And how do you know, if you don't fully understand, how do you know if you're falling short? And I guess that's the message, right?
Yeah.
If you don't fully understand, you don't want to be saying it. The most powerful brands, big and small, and most of them are small challenger brands, right? The most powerful brands are the ones who focus on getting the best possible solution, and then the story tells itself. And that's the big thing for me. If you can bring a level of, I hate the word authenticity, but if you can bring a level of authenticity to the reason why you're doing something, then that is the thing that stands you out from your competitors.
And to be able to back it up.
Yeah, because you focus on getting it right. And whether that is around sourcing slightly more expensive material because of its origins, because you've paid fair wages through the supply chain. If it means about being transparent about where that material has been, what chemicals or what toxicity have been added to it on the way. And actually you can have an open, simple conversation. We talk a little bit about, or, you mentioned before, right, how do we use £3 words rather than £25 words? How do we talk about it so we can explain it to everyone? The biggest challenge with this space is it's very, very inaccessible for most of us, unless you happen to be an expert in that space. So how do we tell very straightforward, obvious stories? And ultimately, if you're being authentic with it, if you're leading for the right reasons, you can tell a really simple story because you're doing it for the right reason.
And I think the reason why, because a majority of sustainability talk is, it's all science-based. It's all come from the scientific community, and then we distill it down and we distill it down and we distill it down, and we try and make it make sense in our 3P words.
Yeah, like what is the one pager? You hear people talk, what's the executive summary? What's the one pager? And complex topics are complex topics, and they're complex for a reason. You can't wash over the science. But how do we make it accessible? How do we make sure that we're not creating barriers in there that mean people can't understand? Very playfully, I always use this. If I can explain it to my dad, then that's the level I want to be explaining to. Not because my dad's stupid, but actually, if I can talk normally, like with your friends down the pub, if you can have a conversation about these challenges, that's the level you need to start at. Not up here with lovely adjectives strung together. Not even science, right? You see lots of claims out there that bring words like regenerative, sustainable, all of these things strung together. What does that actually mean? What does it mean for your business? What does it mean for how that shows up for your employees, for your product? You can get to those stories. They're the powerful ones. I don't want to kind of bring brands out, but Autumn Fair last year, we spoke to a couple of small exhibitors who had really, really compelling stories, really, really honest and well thought through sustainability strategies. Didn't come from trying to create a brilliant marketing strategy. Came because they cared about the product. They cared about the origin and the provenance of the material they were using. And those are the most important stories to elevate, because that's what makes it real.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many of those stories as well.
Yeah, there are.
And I think the more we hear them, the more it inspires others at the end of the day. So, yeah. And I suppose a big reason we've done these white papers together is trying to help those people who run those small and medium businesses, acknowledging that they do possibly around 20 jobs. They have to look after the marketing, they have to look after the sales, they have to look after the operations. And these white papers, I think, will be really valuable, particularly for that community of business owners.
And to really distill it down, so these are the small actions that you can do that actually ladder up into all of that other stuff. So actually you're moving towards doing the right thing, but in a manageable way in your everyday.
Now, one of the topics of the white papers is all around customer trends and the increase in how much we're hearing customers want more sustainable products. I personally really dislike associating the word trend with sustainability, but we have to acknowledge that it needs to be viewed as a trend, I think, by retailers in order to address it in that way. So can you talk to me a little bit about that particular white paper?
Yeah, well, I think, like I said, earlier on, a lot of people say, people will buy more if it's a sustainable product. And actually, we don't necessarily want to get to whether you'll buy more if it's a sustainable product. What we want to do is start to make it easy for the consumer to do the right thing. So, for example, we know if you're buying something online with certain retailers, rather than having it come in multiple packages, you could wait until it's all ready and they can save it, they can send it in one. And then suddenly you're saving carbon and they'll tell you how much you're saving. And that's a really positive nudge to do things differently that's been led by a retailer. Again, we're seeing increases in refill models and sharing and rental models. And this is all, again, really important to start to change how we operate as a society, because we want the easiest solution, don't we? We're all very busy, we want something to be really simple for us. If you make sustainability really difficult and really complex in our everyday life, then nothing's ever going to move. It has to be intertwined and it has to be easy to do. So a lot of the research that we pulled together is actually showing how businesses can kind of look at some of the statistics that are coming through and look at how they can start to move their business in that direction.
Yeah, and I suppose it links back to what you were saying before about trying to see it as an opportunity to do new types of business, to change the way that we've looked at things for years and decades.
And if you think about, and there's so many different mechanisms for that, whether it is products as a service, as we mentioned before, kind of servitization, rental rather than ownership, but also designing for disassembly. How do we make products out of less different types of materials so that actually when it comes to recycling or disassembly or remanufacture, it's much easier to deconstruct those parts. There's lots of amazing brands out there that have modularized products. One part breaks, you can replace it. So you don't have to throw the whole entity away, you can just replace the broken part. And that's everything from brands like Fairphone and mobile phones to Gerrard Street and headphones. But there are huge amounts of examples out there. And I guess that, when we think about consumer trends, That's the really important bit. These products, these types of mechanisms are becoming more and more normalised. That's the bit we need. If it shows up every day, if we can go into our supermarket and there's a reuse counter, if we can go into our local retailer and actually they have a rental service, it normalises that culture, it normalises that approach. And then you see quicker and quicker changes, quicker and quicker gains. But how do you make it easier for the consumer as well? You don't want a scenario where anything you bring in makes it more difficult than the current incumbent. That's even before we get onto the point of price. But how do we make things easy for people? A lot of this is behaviour change, consumer behaviour change, and hopefully to the point where they don't recognise they're doing something different today from yesterday. So it's about being innovative and experimentative. If you can, right? To understand, just because, to your point, just because we've done that for the last 200 years doesn't mean that's the right setup moving forward. Technology has leapt on as a result.
We've also got to remember that next generation that's coming through
Absolutely.
is seeing the world totally differently.
Yeah.
They haven't experienced the world that I've experienced. They look at the world and this is their future. So, we say 2030, 2050. These dates are only around the corner. And if we look at actually the climate change that we're seeing now versus how it's probably going to be in 10 years or 20 years, I'm 45, I'm going to be retirement age by then. But actually for the next generation, that, this is their life. And so we know that next generation of consumers wants to do things differently because actually they want to protect their future. So they look at consumption and brands in a totally different way to what we do. And actually, if brands want to be relevant in 10, 20 years' time, they've got to start doing things differently. Otherwise, that next level of consumer would just not want to buy their product.
Yeah, they'll no longer be relevant.
They won't be relevant.
Yeah.
They'll be old school.
Something else I've noticed as well, alongside an upturn in an interest in sustainability, is quite a lot of scepticism creeping in. How can retailers bat that off? How can they make sure that they're not falling foul?
I think that goes back to the Green Claims Code and why it even exists, actually, because so many people have been saying that they're a sustainable product because they are wanting to basically make some money. And I think it's going back to that whole thing of being truthful, showing the journey you're on, showing where you are on that journey, and being really open and transparent. I think transparency is one of those buzzwords that if we look at how we operate in business today, people haven't asked the gnarly questions. How is this made? How old are the children? What age group have you got making those clothes? A lot of companies haven't asked all of those questions. And actually, we now need to start asking those questions. We need full visibility and transparency on the toxicity of how waters, they're sticking dyes in the local rivers. Do you know what I mean? There's so much there to unpick. I think business just needs to be transparent and ask the questions of how things are being made. And if you show that, then the consumer can't be as negative towards you because you're being really truthful with what you're doing.
I think this is a big theme of our conversation today, is that what business was is not what business is now, and it's certainly not what business is in the future. It's changing so much, and we all have to wake up and accept there's a lot more responsibility, there's a lot more things we need to think about. And I think collectively the world is waking up to that, which is a really nice movement to be part of. And again, going back to the other theme of opportunity that we keep talking about.
And we're in that phase at the moment, or we might just be getting to this phase. We're if you think about circular economy, we're circular-ish at the moment. If you think about, is a circular product in a conventional linear system circular? No, it's not really, but it's better than what existed before. And I think that it's very easy to come out and say to some of the brands that maybe we see doing the most harm or who've done the most harm, why aren't you doing more? Get on and do this. There is that balance between still existing in the market forces that exist today. It's the transition. How do we make sure that when a product moves forward, whether it's around its, the amount of recycled content, the level of scrutiny it's given, that's the next stage in the journey. That's not the end state. We need to be mindful of just shouting that that's not perfect. Perfect isn't the enemy of good, but is good enough? How do we get into those conversations about, right, well, the technology exists for us to do this today, but it's not economically viable. This is the next step, and once we prove that, we can move forward. So I think, how do retailers bat it away? I think it's by being much more open around their roadmap. It's like, well, we're not going to set a 2025 goal, because guess what? 2025 is less than 2 years away. So actually we're almost setting ourselves up to fail. We're going to set a 2030 or 2040 goal, but actually hold us account by how we do against that each year. We need to start having those conversations around where does this come from and what is the problem. But actually, how do we also support as consumers? How do we choose where we put our capital, where we see brands doing the right stuff, and how do we back those organisations who we think are getting it right. No one is getting it right at the moment. No one is perfect. Even those halo brands that you see like Patagonia and IKEA and others, they're not perfect. They're just much further ahead than the nearest incumbent. That doesn't mean they've solved it. They've just got out ahead.
Yeah.
So how do we encourage more brands to catch them up? No one is ever going to be an expert in this space because the landscape is changing too quickly. But how do you make the best decisions based on what we see today and have the courage to say, in 12 months, everything's going to be different because the technology is going to be accelerated, the demand from policy and politicians and consumers is going to be different, the challenge out the window is going to feel much more different. We'll then need to adapt. But you've got to start that journey.
Yeah.
So we've got to give people the opportunity to try.
I feel a lot of the key to success here is around collaboration.
Totally.
And Helen,
Absolutely.
I know that's the purpose really of your organisation, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, Products of Change it was birthed for that. It was for the industry to really share best practice and learn from each other because, there are amazing companies like James said who might be 10 years ahead of the game. But actually, there's no point in them kind of hiding that 10-year, especially if it's in sustainability. The best to actually showcase and share that because actually then it doesn't take the next company 10 years to do. They might be able to do it in 2 or 3 years, which kind of really moves the market forward. So, that is the core of Products of Change, to really educate, to inform each other to change. But in these little bite-sized pieces, because everybody's doing it as their day job. So we have to intertwine it into what you're doing on a daily basis to actually make it effective.
Yeah, and it's one of those rare bits of business, isn't it, that you can talk openly with your competitors about because we're all in it together. We've all got the exact same problem to solve. So rather than us all go off and, spend our own bit of money or time on doing this bit of research, if we all come together, it's going to get done a lot quicker, more cheaply, and many heads are better.
And no one controls the entirety of their supply chain.
Yeah.
No.
Even if you're Google, no one controls all of that. You have to work with others. And we think about carbon and scope emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. As a business, your scope 3 are your suppliers' scope 1 and 2. So you need to be working with these organisations to get that information. It isn't about, how can I corner my piece of the market because you don't control all of that value chain. There's another, lovely that kind of throwaway face. There's no business on a dead planet. And it sounds a little bit extreme, but ultimately when you think about what we're facing, we don't get there by going on our own. We get there by going together and building those relationships. And they do have to be functionally different as well. It's not enough to say we're partnering with this organisation. What does that partnership mean? How do you create pre-competitive scenarios so you can share information? Because actually, if those 2-3 organisations come together, if they solve it, that's their future economic opportunity because they've shifted the way the landscape operates. They've shifted the way the consumer interacts with their brand and their product. And that diversification, that getting out ahead of it is the way that they remain relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to another topic, how much of the evolution that's yet to come do you think is going to be led by changes or additions to policy?
So there's a huge amount of change coming, which is really exciting, actually, because business has a massive responsibility to do this without legislation change. But we know that the minute legislation starts to change, it really puts a rocket into change happening, which is really exciting. So the European Union have the European Green Deal, which is a huge framework on actually how to move Europe to reducing its carbon output. But not just carbon, actually, it's just to reduce its impact. And then because of that, anybody that trades with Europe has to follow suit. So by default, even though the UK is out, we are still in because obviously we trade really heavily with Europe. So they've started with packaging because packaging is one of the first things that we all throw away. So in the UK, we've got new packaging legislation. In Europe, there's new packaging legislation, which is now turning into an extended producer responsibility. So as a producer of product, you need to be responsible for the product that you're putting on the market as far as its environmental footprint. So that started as packaging, but actually the future, it will actually turn into actually being responsible for the actual product in the packaging as well. And then there's lots of other legislation as far as carbon as well, only get into Europe if you've got to be a carbon tax if you produce a certain kind of product. And so there's so much coming down the line, which is really exciting. I think the hard thing is we don't necessarily have the systems to track it all yet. So there's lots of grey areas. but business has to do it. The hope is, we know that EPR, extended producer responsibility, is being discussed in the US now, and there's some other markets that are looking at following suit, because again, if they want to distribute into Europe, you're going to have to follow the same rules. So the hope is that some of the bigger nations start to make more legislative changes than we currently have.
Policy is a really interesting one because it's always slow to react. It always trails behind where some of the front leaders are. But I think what it does when we think about the Hive community is policy in that context is a great leveller. This transition costs money, right? To do something different costs money. And at the moment, you get the argument of, well, the big brands can afford to do things differently because they have the resources. What about the rest of us who don't have the same margins, don't have the same resources? The policy is a great leveller for that. EPR, all of that legislation takes away some of that cost burden at the smaller end and actually just sets a level playing field. And in the cases of some of the kind of plastics tax and packaging legislation, it is graduated based on how large you are and how much impact you have in the market. So it's means tested almost. But what it does is it shifts the overall narrative, it shifts the overall approach. We go back to before about talking about kind of small businesses. How do they start? How do they make a change? How do they compete necessarily against the large retailers? Well, policy enables them to, because all of a sudden it says every brand who puts something onto the market has to do it this way or has to source in this way. Or we've just, in the UK, we've got single-use plastic. It's going to be phased out in October next year. Everyone now needs to find out how to be part of that. You see a lot of the innovative materials to replace plastic packaging in takeaways has been around for a long time in those small independent outlets. Now we're saying that collectively the market has to do it. Now the market has to do it. That economy of scale makes it cheaper for those smaller organisations to do the right thing as well as the large ones. So policy is extremely important, but you can't just rely on the policy to come in. If you're waiting to that point, you're already behind the curve. How do you get out ahead of it? We saw the ASA, Helena spoke about the EU Green Deal, and of course, for those people who potentially are saying, well, but we're not in the EU anymore. That deal, that framework, that theory was put together when we were still part of Europe. So all of UK legislation is built on how that EU Green Deal was manifested. So just because it's the EU Green Deal, we are the same, if not more stringent. The ASA, the Advertising Standards Agency, were the first institution to bring out their guidelines around greenwashing. And they came out, and a lot of people said, well, they'll just have paper teeth. They came out really quickly and went after some big brands who got it wrong. That legislation is really important because it allows us to hold people to account. So I think legislation is really important. Policy is really important. It just takes time. Yeah. And hopefully what it'll allow it to do is create that levelling agenda.
Together, we've chosen to put together a white paper on the topic of policy and legislation. How can our community use that white paper? How would you suggest they apply it to their business?
Again, it's there as a framework, a guidance, a guideline for you, because a lot of the companies that we talk to don't even know that this legislation's on the way. And then if they don't know the legislation's on the way, they can't even start to build the paperwork in their business. So when they then have to pay the tax in a year's time, they can't showcase the amount of material they brought into the market. So then they just have to pay the tax anyway. If you can't show the evidence, you have to pay the tax. So for some small businesses, that could be quite detrimental on the bottom line. If it's some big businesses, it's going to cost them a huge amount of money if they don't do that. So what we wanted to do is showcase, this is what's coming, this is what's here today, this is where things are going. So as people start to go on the journey to better their businesses when it comes to sustainability and reducing their impact, that they can pull their own strategies together, knowing what's coming down the line.
Something that's really driven sustainability, I think, is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Why do you think it is that they have had such an impact and are adopted by so many businesses?
The Sustainable Development Goals were actually created after the Paris Agreement was signed, because many, many years ago, there was an emerging market and then a mature market. There were different rules for those markets because some had used all their resources and some hadn't. And actually, when the Paris Agreement was signed, we need a framework that gives us a fair planet for all, not even just dependent on the market, because obviously because we're a global community, there are ramifications of things that you do in one area versus another. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a framework for governments and for business to start to really understand where you can start your journey to reduce your impact. And it goes all across diversity to sustainability, within different areas, whether it be on land or at sea, fair wages for all. It literally touches on the 17 different elements that actually can mean that we have this fair planet for all.
I think also as well, it made what are quite nebulous and inaccessible topics accessible. They carved them up into 17 different groups, right, which make them manageable to consume in terms of, right, our business makes this particular widget, so actually we align with number 8, number 12 and number 17. So actually we're going to focus on that. It gives you, as Sam said, a framework to start. But I think also by creating those labels or those buckets for some of these big challenges that exist, it allows people to engage with them in a much easier way. And, as we were talking about before, about this kind of inaccessibility of some of these topics and some of the words that are used, it almost creates a playful, if I can describe it that way, a kind of playful, engaging thing. And it is designed, if you take all 17, to look at those intertwined challenges that we face. But you shouldn't expect any business to take on all 17 at once. Actually, where are you in the supply chain? What are the things that are most pressing? Also, I think as well, there's the difference between what aligns directly with your business and also what do you feel most strongly about. And it allows you, therefore, to pick out different buckets that might not be aligned to your business model, but actually which might be fair wages across the supply chain, life below water. How do you align your business behind particular markers, which are internationally recognisable as well? That's one of the big challenges when you think about different jurisdictions. There are different elements to it. The SDGs centralise that on a global standard.
Completely.
And they're trackable as well. So the UN actually track which SDGs certain sectors of business are really focusing on, which then really helps you see the progress that's happening in certain areas as well.
Yeah, I think the accessibility point is a great one. We're Hive, we organise loads of events around the world in different industries. We've got events from fashion to natural resources to engineering to e-commerce. And what the SDGs allow us to do is for each of those events to really understand their sustainable development purpose. And we've found them quite a helpful tool in really carving out how they can make a positive impact on the planet using the power of that event. So we've found them enormously helpful.
It's a common language when there are multiple languages happening.
Yeah, completely. And how can retailers start to use these SDGs if they're not already? What can be a practical first step or couple of steps for them?
I think it's, again, you look at which of the SDGs align to you as a business. And then, as James said, don't do all 17 because that would just be way too many. And they're not all necessarily going to be fully relevant at the beginning of your journey. So, for most retailers, it might be the energy that they're using. So then how do you, switch to renewable energy? So it kind of, within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's then 169 pointers and then a whole more underneath that as well. So as you then kind of focus down on which ones you want to implement, you can then look, well, then how do I do this? And that's what we've put in the white paper, actually, is in, if you to pick this one, actually, these are some really simple questions for you to start asking yourself as a business to start to pull that plan together for yourself.
And whilst there are 17, they're not mutually exclusive, right? There is overlap. So it's about that idea we said before around why. What is your motivation? Which goals do you align against because it's of the interest of your business, or actually you think it's the right thing to do? So I think when retailers or any businesses, they need to look at that and say, right, well, these are the ones that matter most to us, either because that's what our customers say, that's what our employees say, that's what our legislation says we need to focus on. And then actually that's a starting point. It allows you to put your mark in the sand and say, right, this year we're going to focus on these 5 SDGs. And once we make progress on there, we're going to move on to the next 5 or the next 6. And it allows us to break up these wicked meta challenges, right, these nebulous concepts in a way that's actionable.
Much like our white papers, you could say.
Hopefully, right? Yeah. But that's a valid point. Like, it's a snapshot of these very interconnected, complex topics. A way that hopefully allows folks to go, now I get a little bit more than I did 10 minutes ago. Now I know where to go and find more information. And that's the key bit, right? It's how do you inspire people to go and find the next piece of information or the next stage in their journey? It's not about us collectively saying, this is what you need to do. It's saying, this is what you should consider, and this is where you need to go to learn a bit more. And that's the powerful bit about empowering people to go and find the solutions for themselves.
And I think also the white papers, they don't all just stand on their own. They're all
No.
intertwined. They all connect together, so that pathway then links through to all the other bits and pieces. Say, okay, well, now go on this pathway down here and learn more about this. That's going to help you on an everyday basis in your business.
Brilliant.
So I guess one of the key things, though, when you think about circular economy, is it's a hugely nebulous topic. So when we think about where people start, the best thing is always about going and reading more, going and understanding more, getting your own perspective and opinion. Quickest way to do that, download the paper, read what's written in there. Don't take it on face value. Use that as your starting point for your information. There's lots of resources in there, lots of links to different examples as well. But just use that as the starting point to inspire you for where you go next. Type it into Google as well, right? When circular economy first came around about 10, 12 years ago, you type it into Google and they'd probably get about 20, 30,000 hits. Typed it in 2019, that was in the millions, tens of millions. This topic has evolved, continues to evolve. Download the paper, start there, ask questions. Come and find us at the show. Come with your challenges and your questions to expand the conversation and meet other people who are also trying to solve those similar challenges.
What an opportunity for people to have hands-on experts live at the show. I think that's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I think we're going to be there, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully do some surgeries and answer some of these questions.
Yeah.
Because the big thing is, we've mentioned before, a lot of these problems are nuanced. They show up very specifically in a specific business. And actually just having the opportunity to talk that through and understand what else is out there, how other people have solved it, is really, really powerful and a great first step.
Yeah, great. Helena, why should people download our Green Claims Code white paper?
Well, the Green Claims Code white paper is really there to help you navigate what the Green Claims Code is. And all the intertwining rules. I guess it's a rule book for you to make sure that you're actually marketing and talking about your products in the correct way, as not to then have the Competition and Marketing Authority come and sue you for obviously making claims that you can't prove.
Brilliant, thank you. So one of the white papers that we've collaborated on is all around consumer trends.
Yeah.
Why have we chosen that as a topic?
Well, there's so much information out there on consumer trends and what retail is doing and what consumers want. We wanted to put all those salient points together in one place and really navigate you as a business through to what are the areas to really focus on, what does a consumer want, what's retail doing, and actually just looking at the landscape for the future for that next generation as well.
And I guess that's the ambition with all the papers, right? It's taking that sustainability lens onto your business and showcasing through 5 papers where you can start, where you should start, and where you need to go next. So it's just a way to, as Helen says, bring all those bits together in one place on the hub that folks can then go and visit time and time again and download.
Well, hopefully simplifying sustainability.
Simplifying and demystifying.
That's what everybody needs. Yeah. Well, on that note, we've had a great conversation. We've covered a lot of topics there. Helena, James, thank you so much for joining us today in our studio. We really appreciate it, and we're really excited to share these white papers with our customer community and, hope to see some positive change that it inspires as well.
Definitely, and thank you for your partnership, and we're looking forward to working with the community to see how we can really help move everybody forward on this.
And I guess as well, I need to say, right, as we said, these are the starting points of these conversations. If folks need to find out more, they can do through the white papers, they can visit the hub, spring and autumn fairs through the Power of One campaign, right? This is where the conversation starts, but it's definitely not where the conversation finishes. No. So reach out, ask the difficult questions, and that's the only way we find the right kind of partnerships and collaborations to push these things forward.
Yeah, come and visit us at Products Change.
Yeah.
Yes, brilliant.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
We hope you've really enjoyed these conversations all about sustainable development in the retail industry. Head to our website and download the white papers, and we can't wait to see you at the show.